Hi everyone. In this lesson we are going to sketch out the shapes that we need to make a 3D printable design of the child or Grogu or Baby Yoda, whatever you want to call it. So I've grabbed a picture of him off the internet to take a look at what kind of shapes we would need to make something complex like this. There are some obvious things, like his eyes are spheres, and if we want to make a three-dimensional standing version of him, we can see that he's got very round shapes for his cheeks here. These too can be spheres. And his nose, while it's a little more oblong, is just a tiny sphere. To make a flatter version of him, we'll be replacing the spheres with cylinders to create an easier to print one. But even so, we can use those cylinders to create the head and even the ears. The ears are an odd shape that you won't find quite easily, but if we look at this as a cylinder and then we simply cut off part of it that we don't need, we'll end up with a shape left over that is actually what we want. We're going to use this technique to make the shapes that we can't get from our basic shapes. And then we're going to put together a body for him which will be a lot simpler than the head, since you can see that with his little robe here and arms that we can do this with a number of cylinders, or if we are making a flat version, just a few boxes. And our hands, of course, are hard to see in this picture, but he's got stubby little fingers, so we can make them out of stretched out cylinders or spheres. We'll take our shape breakdown and use it to create a standing three-dimensional version. We are going to design our standing up version of our Baby Yoda character and make him out of entirely round shapes. So let's move over to the center of our view and start this guy from scratch. Even though I intend him to have a flat base so he can stand up, I'm going to design him lying down because it's easier to work with my shapes, positioning them on the work plane. So we will start with a sphere, and since it's going to be his head, I'll make it green and turn the steps all the way up to keep it as smooth as possible. Let's use the black handle on the side here just to stretch it out into an oval. And then using our height handle at the top, I'll squash it down a bit. Yeah, maybe it needs to be a little taller than that. So now we have the basis for our head, but with the front of the face being this curved, it'll be a little hard to position all of our elements on there. So I want to make a duplicate of this. I go here and click on the duplicate and repeat. That's going to make a copy of our head shape in the exact same spot as the original. And then I'm going to click on Fit to View, or F on the keyboard, to zoom in to this shape. Now, if I grab my height handle here, I can squash this down or stretch it out. But what I want is a flatter version that's on the front of this to give me some area for his face that isn't so round. So I'm going to use the right mouse button to rotate my view all the way down under the floor so I'm looking at it from below. You can also do this by moving it with the view cube here so that we can see the bottom. Now you can see that my height handle is on the bottom of my object. So if I grab the height handle and I squeeze it up this way, now I have squashed this shape, but I've squashed it up from the floor instead of down from above. So now we have a front area to his face that's a bit flatter, and the back of his head is a bit rounder. It's a little bit too much of a ridge there, so I'm going to look at it from below again, maybe move it down a little bit. I think I like that. Now, we're going to add him some eyes. So let's go ahead and drag in a new sphere, and we will crank up the number of steps and make it black. Let's take our sphere and get it roughly into position. And then, while holding down Shift, I'm going to grab the height handle and shrink the whole thing down a bit. Now, if I get any smaller, it's going to go completely inside of his head. So, looking at it from the side, I'm going to raise this up so it's sticking out the front of his face, and then we will continue holding down Shift and shrinking it down. So we want this guy to have some very big eyes, but that might be a little bit too big. I'm going to go ahead and, without holding Shift, just squash this down a little bit. A little too small. Let's raise it up again. Once I feel like I've got the right amount of eye sticking out of the front here, I'm going to add some details like the cheeks and the eyebrows that are going to cover up the edges of the eye. So it's okay that it's a big circle right now. So let's go ahead and make half of the face at once so that we can then duplicate it over and make the other side. So for our cheek here to be puffing out, we're going to want another sphere. So I'll just duplicate the one that I have here, and we'll move it over and turn it green so it matches his face. And then we can stretch out the sides of our sphere. Possibly move it down a bit. There we go. And now he's got a chubby cheek there. The next, he's going to have his prominent little eyebrow ridges. And so, I don't think we want a sphere for those, as just like the cheek, it's going to puff out all the way around. So I'm going to go down and find the torus. The torus is a nice round donut shape. I can increase the number of sides and the number of steps all the way up to make it as smooth as possible. And you can change the size, the radius of the tube itself, and how thick it is with these sliders. But it'll be hard to judge until it's in place. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back down to, let's say, 2 and 5. All right, so we have a small donut. Let's make it match the face. And then let's raise it up so that it's going to sit on top of his eye. And right now I want it to curve over the top of his eye, so I'm going to look at it from the left or right side here. Try and get a view where I can see this tiny transparent rotate handle. When we click on this, I'll just move it inside the circle to the first step. And now we've got a whole eyebrow going. I think it's maybe a little bit too much on the side there, so I'll move it over. There we go. Now, if we take a look at our first design, this eyebrow comes in and then has a little bit more, it's got little frown lines up there. So let's go ahead and duplicate this guy and then just squash him all the way in. That's maybe a little too much squashing. And try and get ourselves another interesting bump on his head. I think if we increase the tube here, we can make this larger and then sink it lower into his head, so not as much of it sticks out. Perhaps we can rotate it a little bit more. Up. There we go. Now, if we are having trouble getting things into a specific spot, it can be because our snap is default at 1 millimeter. So each time it moves 1 millimeter at a time. We can go ahead and turn the snap grid off or down to 0.1 millimeter. So we move 1/10 of a millimeter each time. Now we can move it in a much more precise way to make our shape exactly the way we want it. Let's take a look at the back side to make sure I haven't stuck an eyebrow at the back of his head. All right. I think this is looking good. We have a nose and mouth to make, but they are going to be directly in the center of the head, while this is going to be the same on either side. So I am going to make a copy of our face shapes so far and flip them over to the other side. It'll be easy to do that if I lock the head in place so that I cannot duplicate it. Let's go ahead and select the face and the head shape and click on the lock button. So now that they are locked, you can see that there are no longer controls for them and I cannot move or change their size. So let's go ahead and click and drag a box around all of our shapes. You can see that even though the locked shapes are selected, if I move these around, it will not change the locked shapes. So let's go ahead and duplicate, and we will duplicate just our unlocked shapes, and then go over to the opposite side and hit mirror. We're going to use the left and right arrow here, and then we're going to use the right arrow on our keyboard to just move it straight over to the side until our shape looks like a face. So there we go. Now we have a matching set of eye, cheek, and eyebrow on the other side. If we want our face to be perfectly aligned with the center here, we can go ahead and select all of the face shapes and then group them together. You can see that group is also going to ignore the locked shapes. I'm going to go ahead and pick this group and turn it to multicolor so that it looks appropriate. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and select the face shape. And even though it is locked and I cannot move it, I can use the Align tool to line other things up to it. So now the face shapes are lined up exactly in the center of the face. And we'll do the same for the nose and the mouth. Let's go ahead and create our nose by getting another sphere. Turning it green and increasing the steps. So now we're going to need to shrink this nose quite a bit, but I want it to be near the top of the face. If I start shrinking it now, it's immediately going to go inside the head. So let's raise it up first, and then hold down Shift and shrink everything at once until we're closer to the size we want. And now we can take the top handle, this black handle, and squash the nose down so it's a small oval. That looks good. Once again, we'll select the face and the Align tool and make sure that the nose is right in the center. And then we're going to use a cylinder for his mouth. In the flat design, we use the cylinder to cut out an area of it just to show that line, the little frown of his mouth. But in this case, I am going to have the upper lip stick out of the front of this guy and a chin underneath it to give that line of his mouth. So we're going to turn this green to match again, increase the number of sides, there we go, to keep it smooth, and then let's go ahead and shrink this cylinder down. Hold down Shift, shrink it down so it stays a cylinder, and then we are going to rotate it because the part of the cylinder we actually want is one of the rounded edges. I want the rounded edge to stick out of the side here so that it looks like his upper lip. So I'm going to rotate this, not a full 90 degrees, but we'll go back one, so 67.5 degrees. Remember to keep it inside of the circle to snap it, otherwise it will go however many degrees you go on the outside. And let's raise this up and move it in so it just sticks out the front of his head. There we go. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and Shift and select the face and line it up with the center again. Now I think we can make this just the tiniest bit bigger. And since it has been rotated, remember that if we scale it in any direction, it's going to stretch out kind of weirdly. Once you rotate an object to a different angle, Tinkercad still only stretches it in the direction lined up to the work plane. You can change this by changing where the work plane is using the work plane tool, but you need to place it on something. So if I were to place the work plane tool on the bottom of this cylinder, you can see that now this orange work plane is lined up perfectly with the cylinder. And now all of our handles are lined up with it, which means that I could stretch it out in the direction the cylinder goes. And that means I can make it a little bit wider without stretching the cylinder out in a weird way. Everything you do to every shape is going to be lined up to this new work plane. So be careful of what you do until you go ahead and drag this work plane tool back onto the floor here. Come on now. Work plane, there we go. And it'll appear blue and be back to normal. So now we've got our mouth shape. He needs a little chin underneath it. I'll just copy his nose since that's a sphere that's already there. We'll do duplicate. And we'll move it, the down arrow key towards us. And then stretch it out. And hold down Alt and grab one side and it will move the other side at the same time. Now let's lower this down. And let's hold down Shift and make the whole thing a little bit bigger. All right. There we go. Now he's got a chin underneath that lip, and it looks like his little frown is in place. So you can see that most of this face was made entirely of spheres. We've got some toruses and a cylinder in there, but with round shapes and just a little bit of manipulation, you can make all sorts of very complicated things. So let's create some ears. I'm going to go ahead and unlock my locked shapes by selecting them and then hitting this little lock button. If you select more than one thing, and some of them are locked and others are not, then you'll just have to lock everything and unlock everything, and it'll all be unlocked. Now I can go ahead and click on my head shape and make a duplicate because I want to make this into the ear. So I'm going to go over to the side with my left arrow key, and it's moving very slowly because I've forgotten that my snap is still on 0.1 millimeter, which was useful for slightly aligning these shapes, but I'm going to set it back to 1.0 so that I can more easily snap things next to each other. I'm going to stretch this out so that it sticks into the face a lot, because I want to use this top edge here as the top edge of the ear, and so I want it to be a very slight curve. Let's go ahead and use our rotate tool. That's a little bit too much. We don't want his ears sticking way up. So I'm going to undo that and zoom out so I can see this a little better. With a large shape, you can see that the circle for the rotate tool goes all the way around the shape. So I'm going to click on it and drag outside of the circle and just tilt it enough so that I like the angle. Now I think that this ear is a little bit too big, so I'm going to hold down Shift and grab one of the handles and then make the entire thing shrink just a bit. Now we'll move it down a little. Let's shrink it again. I think his ears are just about as long as his entire face. Go ahead and make that a little narrower. All right, that looks good. Now I think I will make his ear a little bit flatter by just grabbing, no shift this time, the top height handle and move it a little bit down so it's not sticking out of the front of his face. And now we are going to cut out from this sphere so that we have an opening in the ear and it doesn't look like a solid shape. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. Let's see. Now that I have a second copy of this ear in the exact same spot, I'm going to turn it into a hole, and then we'll use the arrow keys to move 1 millimeter at a time and get it into a position where we're going to cut the front out of the ear, not the back. Let's go ahead and use our raise and lower, which you can actually do by holding down Control and the up and down arrows. So you can use your arrow keys to move 1 millimeter up and down, just like you can do in any other direction. So now we have a top edge of the ear folding over, and we can see that we're going to cut out a big section but leave the back in place. So let's go ahead and drag a box to touch both of the shapes that I need for my ear and group them together. And there we go. Now we have a big ear with an opening. Well, I think it's a little bit too far back on his head. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Control again and just go 1 or 2 millimeters up so it's sticking out the side of his head. There we go. Now I can use duplicate again and mirror, and we'll click on the left right arrow and then go ahead and move it over till it's sticking out the other side of his head. And now I've got all of the elements of his face and ears in place. I'm going to go ahead and group this together so that I can't accidentally move any of his features into the wrong place. So let's group this. Perfect. Now it's time to make those robes. So we are going to start with a cylinder. Well, on our flat version, we used a box because we wanted flat sides. We're going to be making this guy to stand up. So the only flat surface he really needs is the bottom, so that we can stand him up when he's done. So let's increase the number of sides. We'll make this an appropriate color. And we'll go ahead and look at it from the side so that we can rotate it 90 degrees. Oop. Be careful when rotating. This up and down arrow is often right in the way, so you can have to look at it at an angle sometimes. There we go. Now we can see that this shape is quite a bit taller than him, so I'm going to shorten it a little bit. Now we'll go ahead and make it wider than his head. He's got a big collar around, so you can really only see his head. And it's just barely touching the bottom of the circle here. So when we create this as a single solid shape, this will be merged together, but we might want to put some more reinforcement in there. And we're going to create a collar for him so we can make that touch his head so that he becomes a more solid shape and he's not in danger of his head breaking off. So first, let's drag the bottom of this cylinder out and decide how tall we want him to be. It's very small, but he's at least a couple of heads tall. I'm only worrying about the proportions and not the final size, because once we are done with our model, we're going to scale it to the appropriate size for what we want to use it for. And just like our other designs, you can add some kind of functionality to it at the end by either adding some way to hang it, or since he stands up, we might give him the ability to hold something for us. But for now, we're only worried about the design. So let's go and get our favorite donut out here, bring out the torus, change it to an appropriate color, and increase the number of sides. And then we're going to go ahead and rotate it 90 degrees. Since we know exactly how far we want to rotate it, we can also always click on the handle and then the number and actually type in. So if you typed in 90 degrees, oops, sometimes, select that, 90, there we go. It'll rotate all the way around. And since the shape was on the floor when it rotated, half of it went under the floor. So let's go ahead and hit D on the keyboard. There's no button for this, but D, you can remember, is for drop. And that will put our bottom of our shape onto the floor. Now we're just going to stretch this guy out in place so that he makes a collar. And I should go ahead and hit F to get closer in here. And let's make sure that this is going to actually touch all of the things we want it to. His collar is supposed to touch the edges of his face to keep him attached very well. And we can see that because it was on the floor, as is the bottom of our cylinder, the cylinder is actually sticking out from the back here. Now we're not worried about the back side of him being flat, as we were on a flat design, because we are not going to print him with his back attached to the floor. So while we look at this from the underside, we can fix what we want the back of his collar to look like by using the height measurement to drag it down and go further underneath the floor. All right. Now that we have our collar, let's add some detail to it. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this shape, and then using my rotate handle, just tilt it a little bit to the side, and then we'll use the arrow keys to move it down one. All right. So you can see that since these shapes are so close together, they're just going to merge together into one shape that's slightly bulkier on one side than the other. We want one of them to look like an overlapping piece of his collar. I'm going to raise this up, not raising it up with the up and down arrow, but just with the height measurement, so it sticks out a little bit forward. And we want this to be the edge of his robe there. So we're going to use a hole to cut this part off. So I'm going to go all the way up to the box. And we're going to find a position where we want to cut part of our torus away so that it looks like it comes to an end, the edge of his robe there. Let's go ahead and raise this up a little bit. You can see that this will cut all the way down to the floor. I don't like that too much because it's going to leave another weird shape down here. So instead, we're going to go ahead and, looking at it from below, drag this down under the floor as well, so we can cut this thing in half. And it looks like I probably should have cut it before I tilted it, because the line's going to go straight down now. So instead, I'm going to rotate my box a little bit too. There we go. That looks a little better. Now, with this box selected, I need to be careful and hold down Shift and select only the piece that I want to cut. This way, I'm only going to group these two and cut this torus and not any of the others. So let's go ahead and hit Group. And now he's got this front part of his collar, a little bit of a line. Oh, it looks like it's overlapping. And it's doing the same in the back, so I'm going to, from the back, go ahead and raise this up so that it's hidden inside. And there we go. Now we'll do the same trick with the cylinder that makes up his robe so that the seam goes all the way down. Let's go ahead and make a duplicate of this, and then we'll make it a little bit taller by just grabbing our height measurement. 1 or 2 millimeters is good. And then we'll grab a box and we'll stretch this box out so it's going to cut the entire cylinder in half. Go ahead and move it over just a little bit. Let's go ahead and turn our snapping down so we can line it up perfectly with our other line. And then turn it back to 1 millimeter so I don't forget. Let's hold down Shift and select just the cylinder that we want to cut and group those. And now we have a seam all the way around. So when we add all of these shapes together, it looks like his robe wraps around him. Great. And we'll give him a little bit of something at the bottom here so that it looks like it's piled up around his feet, which you can't see. I'm just going to select the collar shape, and I'm going to duplicate that one, and we'll use the arrow keys to move it down to the bottom. Let's go ahead and squash this a little bit flatter. Maybe we will make the radius of the tube bigger. Yeah, that looks good. So now he's sitting on this donut, which you can see is going to make the bottom of him not very flat. And that's not great. So we're going to have to fix that by using another hole. Let's go ahead and move this down. So it's just kind of curve down at the bottom here. And we'll grab a box. And you can see that this one goes down below the floor. So let's make sure that our box also goes down below the floor. And then drag it all the way across. Oops, it's not tall enough either. So there we go. Now we're going to cut off all of that excess area and make the bottom of him flat once again. So now I can go ahead and join all of my shapes here in order to do this. But first, I want to go ahead and make his arms. Since we already have a cylinder and a torus here that make up a shape similar to his sleeves, I'm going to select this cylinder and then shift select the collar here. Now we're going to duplicate it and move it over to the side. So I have a shape I can reuse to make his sleeves. But now I'm going to go ahead and get this hole out of the way by dragging a box that connects all of our shapes for our robe, including this box, and we'll group them together. Now he's got a wider base at the bottom of his robe so he can stand up well. And we've got a shape that we're going to use to make our sleeves. Let's go ahead and adjust our duplicate of our robe here. I'm going to select both of them at the same time, and then we'll just shrink them down until we think it's about the right size for his arms. Shrink them. All right. And we're not too worried about how long this is because we're going to stick it inside of his robe to connect it to him. We just need to make a hand on the end here. So much like my flat version had cylinders for hands, I'm going to go ahead and grab a sphere. We'll increase the steps and turn it green. We're going to use this for his hand. So, hitting F to get in close, we'll squash it down and keep on moving all of the sides in until it matches up with our sleeve. So there's a little sphere for his chubby hands. We'll go ahead and duplicate this and then stretch it out and make it narrow for his fingers. think it'll have to go up just a bit to be stuck in the middle there. Now, remember that if we make a move and then duplicate and repeat, we're going to make that same move again, so it's going to get stretched and shrunk down, which is not what I want. So I have to click on something else or an empty space, click on my shape again, and duplicate. Now I can move it over to be my middle finger here, and duplicate again, and we'll make our third finger. Once again, this isn't quite in the right spot, so I'm going to turn off my snapping and get it to where I feel like it's good. And we'll maybe rotate his fingers out a little bit so he's got his hands sort of reaching up and up. There we go. Now we can go ahead and play around with his finger and hand position as much as we want to get it looking the way we might like. I'm just going to rotate them a little bit so that he's got his arms open, or hands open there. And now that I like how that's looking, I'm going to go ahead and join my whole arm together as one object. So I'm going to go ahead and drag a box that touches all of those shapes. We'll group it together, and we'll go into color and switch it to multicolor. Now, so that everything lines up again, I'm going to switch this back to 1 millimeter. Now let's go ahead and put some arms on this guy. I'm going to have one arm sticking out, so he's reaching, and one arm facing down. So we'll go ahead and take our right arm here, and we'll rotate it until it's facing downward. And since it's lying on the floor, for other shapes, it's sticking out the back of him. So we want to go ahead and raise it up until it is sticking out of the middle of his coat. Now that I have attached it to him, it looks a little bit big compared to him. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and shrink the whole arm down until I think it's about the right size. That looks good. And making sure that his fingers aren't below the bottom of him, which will make it impossible for him to stand up. Then we're going to go ahead and duplicate the entire arm. Oops. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to flip it into the other direction. So right there, we can have him with both of his arms down and his hands open. But instead, I'm going to make this one sticking out forward so that he is reaching. So let's try and rotate this into the right position. Rotating in a bunch of different directions can be difficult, so be prepared to undo things if it doesn't turn the way you expect it to. So I'm going to start by rotating around from above so that his hand is facing up. And then looking at it from the side, I'm going to rotate around this way. And we can already see that his hand is sticking forward. I'm going to turn it a little more in this direction. If I can click on the rotate handle, there we go. So it's facing almost straight up. And then let's raise it into the air and get it out there. So now our little Baby Yoda is reaching out. I think his hand is pointing too much. So I'm going to go ahead and ungroup this shape. So now I have all of the parts of the hand and arm separate. I can look at it so that I can select just the hand without any of the arm parts, and I can rotate them by themselves. since they rotate around their center and not around where it looks like they're supposed to be attached, I'm going to have to zoom in here and move it around a little bit to get it to look like it is stuck inside the sleeve again. There we go. Now that I've got his hand facing out like that, it looks much more like he's reaching out with his open hand. All right, now that we've got him to do the magic hand thing, we can add any other details or functionality before we group them together. But I think I'll just give him a ball in his other hand. Let's turn this to silver and hold down shift and shrink it down. Ooh, down, not up. And we'll raise it up so that it's in his hand. There we go. Perfect. That's what he needed. And once we like how he looks, we're going to drag a box around everything at once and hit group. And now we are ready to figure out how we're going to print him. And we are going to take our standing Baby Yoda figure and set him up to print. So let's select our object, make sure that it is grouped all into one single shape, and click on Export. We're going to go and make sure we're only exporting the selected shape. So in my case, I don't get any of my other examples, or you might have something off screen that you just don't know is in your project. And we'll create an STL file. Now let's go ahead and switch over to Cura. And with our little folder icon here, we're going to open up our new version. And we can see that as he is lying down, if we take a look at him from below, all of these bottom facing surfaces are going to be red, which means that they need some supports. It's even got some surfaces on the inside here. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see this better. Okay, here we go. On the inside of his collar here, and on the inside, underside of his cheeks, all of that. Now these are curved upward, and so they don't necessarily need supports. By default, our settings are going to try to put supports on anything that faces downwards, and we can probably skip some of them. But let's take a look at better ways we might have to print this guy. So since he is supposed to stand up, we do have a perfectly flat surface on the floor here. We could set this upright, and let's take a look at what that would do. If we select our character here, we go to the rotate tool, we can choose this last one that says select a face to align to the build plate. And then we just have to select the bottom face by clicking it. You can see that it lined the bottom up, and now it's even highlighted in blue. And now we have a lot of different areas that we're going to have supports on. So in this case, you can see that the upper edges of the ears here are going to need supports, as well as underneath his eyebrows, his nose, his cheeks, the bottom side of this lip here, which means that there's a lot of parts of the face that might possibly have sagging and ruin our face design, or just have support built into them that will be hard to remove from between his face and the collar there. This is an area that'll be hard to get in there with like an X-Acto knife to try to clean out the supports. But let's go ahead and take a look at what the supports would look like. I'm going to go over to my supports, make sure that it's set to generate, and we'll generate supports everywhere, and we'll go ahead and hit slice. So let's click on the preview here and see that it's going to generate a huge tower of support underneath his ears, since we also have to support the bottom edge here, as well as some supports under this lip. So not as much difficult supports on the face as I might have worried about. But he will also need supports all the way up this arm that's sticking out here, and our other arm, and even the front of his collar. So we can take a look as we scroll down. Let's deselect this so we don't see that rotate tool all the time. And see that in between his face and his collar there is going to be some supports under here that will probably never be able to get out, but they'll be pretty much hidden by his head. Now this is a case of something where we might want to increase the strength of this, especially if we're printing it very small, by going in and adding a cylinder to fill in this empty space here. So if we went back to our design, we could take a look at this little gap that is all the way around his head, and we could fill that in by either extending this or adding another cylinder that just fills in this area, so we don't have to worry about it. For now, I'm going to go back into this and see what it'll look like if it is supported a different way. So you can see that in our custom settings, we have some options for supports. I'd like to try to go to the support structure and click on this, and instead of normal, we'll click tree. Normal supports are towers that shoot straight up from underneath and then attach to whatever is above them. Tree supports are going to be designed, let's slice it and see, in order to grow sort of like a tree. And we can see here, if we get the color coding back on, all of the blue shapes are the tree supports. And the amount of time it takes is a little bit less, since the tree supports are actually hollow. But you can see that it's going to build a shape that looks like a plant that grows around him to hold up all of the little bits. Unfortunately, it does look like there's going to be more weird stuff going on his face, which we'll have to clean up. So if the tree supports this way aren't great, what would happen if we went ahead and rotated him back to normal? So let's go ahead and undo that last rotate. So we have him lying down on his back. Despite not having a flat surface, it might be a good idea to slice your file with a shape lying down on his back, because that will mean that all of the supports happen on a surface that doesn't have details that we want to keep. Now I can see that the details of his face have become really hard to see because of the color coding here. But all of the support structures come from behind him and go up on his back. Since he has smooth, round areas on his back, they will be fairly easy to break off of and easy to clean up, since you can sand smooth areas down. We can go ahead and change how bad his face looks here by increasing the quality. You can see that I'm still set on our low quality profile, which is 0.28 millimeters. So if we make our layer height smaller, we're going to get better detail in all these round shapes of his face. And with the quality level being higher, or the layer being smaller, you can see that the default support angle increases. So we have less areas that require support because our overhangs are smaller because of the layer height being smaller. Now we have less supports to worry about, just this one tree that goes up to touch the bottom of his arm. So we can experiment and see how well he comes out lying down and how well he comes out standing up using our tree supports. And if lying down causes too much of a mess on the back, we can even try and print him at a 45-degree angle. This means that most of our areas will be tilting up at 45 degrees, which makes them under our necessary support angle, though it looks like he's going to end up with a lot of tree on his back because of these curved surfaces. So after some experiments, it looks like lying down on his back might be the best way to print this guy without too much support and with better detail. We'll go ahead and undo that last move, and we'll slice him one more time. All right, still a 4-hour print at this size, but now we can save his G-code to the file, and we are ready to print.